Before she died, Diana did something the palace never saw coming. She didn't just fight for her legacy, she engineered it. And buried inside that legacy was something that would take decades to fully detonate. But now, in 2026, it has. Charles is furious, and the institution is scrambling to contain damage that Diana, from beyond the grave, essentially predicted. Most people remember the Panorama interview as a moment of raw emotion, a princess sitting alone under soft studio lights, telling the world her marriage had been crowded by 3 people. But what most people don't fully appreciate is how calculated that moment was. Diana didn't stumble into that interview. She planned it. She contacted the BBC's Martin Bashir herself through back channels, and she prepared for weeks. She knew exactly what she was doing, and more importantly, she knew exactly what it would do to Camilla. Because by naming the affair so directly, so publicly, Diana didn't just expose Charles. She permanently attached Camilla's name to betrayal in the minds of millions of viewers. That was the bomb, and it was set with a very long fuse. What made it so powerful wasn't just the interview itself, it was the timing. Diana gave that interview in November 1995, at a moment when the palace was quietly beginning to explore how Camilla might eventually be rehabilitated in the public eye. There were early conversations, careful positioning, tentative steps toward normalization. Diana knew this. She had sources inside the palace, staff, courtiers, people who admired her and fed her information, and she used that intelligence to strike at precisely the right moment. The interview didn't just embarrass Charles, it reset the entire rehabilitation clock back to 0. But Diana didn't stop there. In the months that followed, she gave carefully chosen interviews to journalists and authors, each one adding another layer to the narrative she was constructing. She spoke about her own pain, yes, but she also spoke about Camilla with a precision that was almost surgical, never hysterical, never vindictive in tone, just quietly devastating. She described Camilla as a permanent third presence in her marriage, a phrase so vivid it lodged itself into the cultural memory of an entire generation. And that is exactly what Diana intended. She understood something that the palace's communications teams, with all their resources, somehow didn't. She understood that public sympathy, once given, is almost impossible to take back. And by positioning herself as the wronged woman, gentle, vulnerable, honest, she made it nearly impossible for the public to ever fully extend that same sympathy to Camilla. What Diana left behind wasn't just grief. It wasn't just a legacy of charitable work or fashion or that particular quality of warmth that cameras seemed to chase. What Diana left behind was a narrative framework, a story about Camilla that was written so deeply into the public consciousness that even a coronation couldn't erase it. The bomb was always there. It was always going to go off. Here is something the palace has never wanted to admit. Diana was not the naive, out-of-her-depth young woman they originally tried to manage. By the mid-1990s, she had become one of the most strategically intelligent operators the royal family had ever produced, and she understood the institution's weaknesses better than most people who had spent their entire careers inside it. She knew, for example, that the monarchy runs on image, not on tradition, not on duty, on image. And she knew that image, once cracked, takes generations to repair. What very few people know is that Diana maintained an informal but remarkably effective intelligence network inside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. Trusted members of staff passed her information. Courtiers who admired her kept her informed of internal conversations she was never supposed to hear. Even some members of the press who had access to palace briefings would quietly loop back to Diana's team with what was being said. She knew about the early Camilla rehabilitation discussions before they became formal strategy. She knew which journalists the palace was cultivating to soften Camilla's image. She knew the timeline they were working toward, and she used every piece of that knowledge to stay one step ahead. But there is something even more striking than her tactical intelligence. Diana predicted, with uncomfortable accuracy, that Camilla would never be fully accepted by the British public. She said it privately to friends. She implied it in interviews. She believed fundamentally that no amount of palace management could override what the public had decided to feel. And for nearly 3 decades, she was right. What Diana also understood was the power of children as legacy carriers. She raised William and Harry with a very deliberate emotional openness, something completely alien to royal tradition. She wanted them to feel things, to remember things, to one day be able to speak about things. That wasn't accidental parenting, it was architectural. She was building the next generation of her own story's defenders, even if she never framed it that way explicitly. Diana also made a point of cultivating her own relationship with the press entirely separately from the palace machine. She understood that whoever controlled the narrative controlled the institution, and she was determined that the narrative would not be controlled by the people who had, in her view, failed her so completely. What Diana actually knew was this: the palace could manage the present, but it could not manage memory, and memory, in the end, is the only thing that truly matters. Let's be honest about something that rarely gets said plainly enough. Camilla Parker Bowles becoming Queen Consort is one of the most remarkable image rehabilitations in modern British history, and it almost didn't happen. When Diana died in August 1997, public feeling toward Camilla reached its lowest possible point. There were genuine questions inside the palace about whether Camilla could ever appear at a public function without triggering protest. Some senior courtiers privately believed the relationship between Charles and Camilla would have to remain permanently in the shadows, tolerated but never formalized. But Charles refused to accept that. He was, by all accounts, absolutely determined that Camilla would be recognized fully, officially, and publicly, and so began one of the most carefully managed public relations campaigns the monarchy has ever run. It started small. Camilla began appearing at low-profile charity events, then at slightly higher-profile ones. She was photographed looking warm, approachable, grandmotherly. The sharp edges of her public image were systematically softened. By 1999, Charles and Camilla were photographed together publicly for the first time at a party at the Ritz in London. It was presented as almost accidental, casual, low stakes, but it was anything but. That photograph was a trial balloon, carefully released to test public reaction. The reaction was mixed, but it wasn't the explosion the palace feared, and so the campaign continued. What most people don't know is that the palace hired external consultants to specifically model public opinion on Camilla at regular intervals throughout the early 2000s. They tracked sentiment. They identified the demographic groups most resistant to her. They adjusted the strategy accordingly. By the time Charles and Camilla married in April 2005, the palace had spent nearly 8 years methodically moving public opinion, millimeter by millimeter. But here is what that entire campaign could never fully overcome: Diana's voice. Every time Camilla took a step forward, Diana's panorama interview resurfaced somewhere. A documentary, an anniversary retrospective, a new biography. And every time it resurfaced, a new generation encountered Diana's account of her marriage for the first time. Younger viewers who had no memory of the 1990s were suddenly watching Diana speak, calm, precise, heartbreaking, about the woman who is now their queen consort. The palace could manage the present, but it could not manage the algorithm, and the algorithm kept serving Diana. By the time Camilla was formally elevated to queen consort at the 2023 coronation, she had technically won the institutional battle. But the cultural war, the one Diana started, was far from over. And then something happened that nobody in the palace was fully prepared for. In late 2024 and into 2025, a combination of forces collided simultaneously, and Diana's long fuse bomb finally detonated with full force. First, the renewed global interest in Diana, driven by multiple converging projects, documentaries, streaming series, new biographical material, brought her story back to the center of public conversation with an intensity the palace hadn't seen since the 20th anniversary of her death. But this time, the conversation had a different quality. It wasn't nostalgic, it was interrogative. People weren't just mourning Diana, they were asking questions. Questions about what really happened in that marriage. Questions about who knew what and when. Questions about Camilla's role, not just as the other woman in the 1990s, but as queen consort now. The internet, and particularly social media, amplified these questions in ways that traditional palace communications simply cannot counter. A clip of Diana's panorama interview on TikTok can reach 20 million people in 48 hours. A palace press release reaches nobody who wasn't already paying attention. But then came the second trigger, and this one was more specific. A new wave of reporting, drawing on previously unpublished accounts from people close to Diana in her final years, began to surface details about just how deliberately Diana had constructed her public legacy, details about the documents she kept, the letters she wrote, the instructions she left with trusted friends about how her story should be told after her death. What emerged was a portrait of Diana, not as a victim, but as an architect, a woman who had looked clearly at her own situation and decided, with remarkable composure, to ensure that the truth as she understood it would outlast every attempt to bury it. That reframing hit Camilla's position like a freight train, because it fundamentally changed the moral geometry of the story. If Diana was not a passive victim, but an active architect of her own legacy, then Camilla is not simply a woman who waited patiently for acceptance. She is a character in a story that Diana wrote. And in that story, the roles are already assigned. Charles found himself caught, once again, at the exact intersection he has always occupied, between the woman he chose and the woman the world will never stop grieving. His anger, reported by sources close to the palace as barely contained in private, is not just about the headlines. It is about the realization that Diana's final act is still being performed, and there is nothing he can do to stop it. What people underestimate about Charles is how personally he feels every resurgence of this narrative. This is not a king calmly absorbing bad press. This is a man who has spent 50 years trying to resolve one of the most publicly painful private situations in modern history, and who keeps finding that resolution permanently out of reach. Sources close to the palace have described Charles in recent months as deeply frustrated, not just irritated. Frustrated in the way that only comes from watching the same wound reopen, again and again, no matter how carefully it has been tended. The specific source of his fury this time is the framing. Charles can tolerate being criticized. He has been criticized his entire adult life. But what he cannot tolerate, what sources say genuinely enrages him, is the suggestion that Diana's legacy is being used as a weapon against Camilla by forces he cannot identify or confront, because that is exactly what is happening, and there is no press conference he can call, no statement he can release, no public appearance he can make that directly addresses it without making everything dramatically worse. He is cornered. But there is a layer to this that goes even deeper. Charles's coronation was supposed to represent a new chapter, a moment when the painful history of his first marriage was finally, formally, left behind. Camilla was crowned beside him. The institution had spoken. But what Charles is discovering, with what sources describe as a kind of exhausted disbelief, is that the coronation settled the institutional question, but did nothing to settle the public one. Camilla is queen consort in title, but in the court of public opinion, Diana's ghost still holds enormous authority. And then there is William. Charles's relationship with his eldest son has always carried the particular tension of two people who love each other, but represent, in some fundamental way, competing versions of the monarchy's future. William does not need to say anything about Camilla publicly. He never does. But his visible, consistent championing of Diana's memory, the statue at Kensington Palace, the quiet endorsements of Diana-related projects, the way he speaks about his mother whenever he chooses to, sends a message that the palace's communications team cannot contradict. Charles sees it, he understands it, and according to people close to the family, it is a source of profound and ongoing tension between father and son. Diana may be gone, but through William she still has a seat at the table, and Charles cannot ask her to leave. Nobody in the royal family understands the power of Diana's legacy better than the man who inherited it. William has never been loud about his mother. He doesn't need to be. The power of what he carries is precisely in its restraint. When William does speak about Diana, carefully, selectively, always on his own terms, the effect is enormous. A single mention of his mother in an interview can generate more coverage than months of palace communication strategy, and William knows this. What is less understood publicly is the degree to which William has actively shaped how Diana's memory is maintained. He was closely involved in the creation of the Kensington Palace Memorial Garden. He has had quiet but firm conversations with documentary makers and authors about how Diana's story is framed. He has on more than one occasion made clear to people inside the institution that his mother's legacy is not available to be managed, minimized, or redirected for institutional convenience. That position creates an obvious and permanent tension with Camilla's presence. William has never been openly hostile to Camilla. He is too disciplined for that, but sources who have observed the family dynamics over years describe a relationship between William and Camilla that is, at best, formally correct, polite, functional, never warm, and in the coded language of royal family dynamics, the absence of warmth is itself a statement. But there is something even more significant happening beneath the surface. William has begun, quietly and deliberately, to position the future of the monarchy around values that are explicitly Dianic: emotional openness, direct engagement with ordinary people, mental health advocacy, a willingness to be seen as human rather than institutional. These are not Charles's values. They are not Camilla's values. They are Diana's values, transplanted into the next generation by a woman who understood, even in the middle of her own crisis, that the monarchy's survival depended on them. What Diana set in motion through her children is arguably the most consequential thing she ever did. More consequential than the Panorama interview, more consequential than her humanitarian work, because she didn't just win the argument of her own generation, she seeded the argument into the next one. And now that argument about what the monarchy should look like, who should embody it, and what kind of humanity it should project, is being played out in real time, with William on one side, and Camilla, however unfairly, perceived on the other. Diana didn't just leave a legacy, she left a direction of travel, and the institution is still being pulled along it. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody inside Buckingham Palace wants to say out loud. Camilla's position is secure institutionally, but institutionally secure and culturally accepted are two entirely different things, and the gap between those two things is where Diana's legacy continues to operate. The palace has always worked on the assumption that time heals public sentiment, that if you manage the present carefully enough, the past eventually loses its grip. But what they are discovering with Camilla, and what Diana seemingly understood before anyone else, is that some wounds in public consciousness don't heal on an institutional timeline. They heal on a cultural one, and culture moves to its own rhythm. The streaming era has fundamentally changed the equation. Older rehabilitations, think of how Edward VIII's abdication was eventually absorbed into history as a footnote rather than a crisis, happened in an information environment where the palace had significant control over what reached the public and how. That environment no longer exists. Diana's story is not archived. It is alive. It is being rediscovered, reinterpreted, and redistributed constantly across platforms, across generations, across borders. And every rediscovery is another moment when Camilla's position is implicitly re-examined through Diana's lens. For Charles, the stakes are existential in a way that goes beyond personal feeling. He needs his reign to be defined by something other than this. He has genuine policy interests, environmental commitments that span decades, a vision for a modernized, slimmed-down monarchy, but the narrative keeps collapsing back into the same triangle. Charles, Diana, Camilla, and as long as that triangle dominates the cultural story of his reign, everything else he wants to build is competing for oxygen. The question of what happens next hinges on one thing above all others: William. When William eventually becomes king, he will have choices to make about how Diana's memory is formally held within the institution. He could choose to integrate it, to build a monarchy that explicitly honors Diana's legacy as a founding principle of its modern identity. Or he could choose to let it quietly recede, as institutions prefer to do with complicated histories. But here is what every close observer of William believes. Without exception, he will not let it recede. Diana's final act was not just the panorama interview. It was not just the letters, the documents, the carefully constructed narrative she left behind. Her final act was William, and William is still very much in motion. The time bomb Diana left behind has gone off, but the aftershocks are only just beginning. Diana understood something that kings and queens rarely do, that the most powerful throne is not made of gold, it is made of memory, and she built hers to last. Camilla may wear the crown, but Diana still holds the story.